Did you really come here alone with that old laptop? This court will crush you.
Then why are you so afraid of a single word from me? Sit down. You're about to hear it.
The courtroom door felt heavier than it should have. Maybe it was the past 6 months pressing against it, or maybe it was the fact that everything I owned fit inside a single, worn leather bag slung over my shoulder. My fingers tightened around the laptop I'd bought on clearance 3 years ago. Flickering screen, loose hinge, still breathing barely, just like me. I stepped inside. And there he was, Calvin Royce, CEO of Royce Systems Group, my former boss. He sat at the plaintiff's table in a tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than my rent for the entire year. His attorney leaned in, whispering something polished and confident. Calvin looked up, saw me, and smiled. Not a polite smile, not a professional one. He laughed, actually laughed. He didn't say a word, but his mouth shaped it clearly enough. "You're finished." The smile widened when he noticed I didn't have an attorney sitting beside me. No legal team. No associates flipping binders. Just me. Alone, holding a battered laptop like it was a life raft. To him, this must have looked like mercy. Or weakness. He thought I was walking into this room unarmed. He wasn't entirely wrong. My hands were shaking, but not from fear. I walked to the defendant's table, set the laptop down carefully, and exhaled. Inside my bag were 3 folders, blue, red, and yellow, labeled, tabbed, organized with the kind of precision you develop when your survival depends on it. Calvin had no idea what was inside them, no idea what I'd uncovered during the longest 3 weeks of my life, and before this goes any further. You need to understand something. I never wanted to be here when Calvin fired me. He said it wasn't personal, restructuring. He called it, even though I'd spent 5 years building the system that kept his company alive, every core process, every internal tool, every algorithm investors bragged about. But the real blow came 2 weeks later when a courier delivered a lawsuit to my apartment. Calvin wasn't just firing me, he was trying to erase me. And as the bailiff stood and announced, "All rise," Calvin Royce still believed he was in control. He had no idea that when my turn came to speak, his smile would vanish. If you're listening right now, I hope you're doing okay, really. If it's been a while, this might be a good moment to check your blood pressure or jot today's reading down. Just to stay ahead of your health, let me know where you're listening from. I read those comments more than you think, and if this story resonates, consider subscribing so you don't miss what comes next. Because what I discovered after that courtroom smile is where everything truly begins. When the judge took her seat and the courtroom settled into silence, something inside me shifted. Not relief, not confidence, focus. Calvin Royce still looked relaxed. That was the part that bothered me. His laughter had faded, but the certainty behind it hadn't. He sat back in his chair as if this were just another meeting he expected to dominate. I didn't look at him again. Instead, I looked down at my laptop, the same machine I'd bought 3 years ago, the same one I'd carried through temp jobs, late nights, rejection emails, and quiet panic. The hinge creaked as I opened it. The screen flickered once, then steadied. It was enough. The judge asked Calvin's attorney to begin. He stood smoothly, confident in the way men are when they believe the outcome is already decided. He spoke about contracts, about loyalty, about non-compete clauses Calvin had personally approved and signed. He framed me as reckless, disloyal, ungrateful. I listened without reacting, because I'd heard it all before. When Calvin fired me 5 years into building Royce Systems Group's core infrastructure, he'd used the same tone, calm, detached, almost sympathetic. He'd said the company was moving in a different direction, that my role was no longer strategic. 2 weeks later, the lawsuit arrived. Violation of a non-compete, theft of proprietary technology, claims designed not just to win but to scare me out of existence. And they almost worked. Job interviews vanished the moment recruiters saw the pending case. Savings disappeared faster than I expected. I sold furniture, took contract work far below my skill level, learned how thin walls really are when you're trying not to let anyone hear you break. But something strange happens when fear drags on long enough. It exhausts itself. 3 weeks before the hearing, during a night I couldn't sleep, I opened my old work files, not to fight, not even to prepare. I just missed the work, missed the part of myself that felt capable. That's when I noticed the email. Old, buried. Easy to miss, sent during my second year at Roy Systems Group from Calvin's predecessor. The subject line mentioned filing details, patent paperwork, a request to confirm my legal name. At the time, I'd thought nothing of it, just another administrative step, another form. But forms matter. I remembered the attachment. I opened it again that night, and my name was there. Not the company's, not Calvin's, mine. I spent days verifying it. Public records, calls, quiet conversations with someone who knew intellectual property law better than I did. Each answer came back the same. The company had never completed the assignment. The patent wasn't theirs. It never had been. Back in the courtroom, Calvin's attorney finished speaking and sat down with a satisfied nod. Calvin glanced at me again, still calm. The judge turned. "Mr. Merton," she said, "you may respond." I stood, and for the first time since I'd walked through that heavy door, my hands stopped shaking because silence was over and truth was finally allowed to speak. I didn't rush. That was the first thing Calvin noticed. People who are bluffing always rush. They speak fast, move fast, try to stay ahead of their own fear. I did the opposite. I stepped forward slowly, opened the blue folder, and handed copies to the clerk. "This," I said, my voice steady, "is the original patent filing for the algorithm in question." The judge adjusted her glasses and scanned the first page. Her eyebrows lifted just slightly. Calvin leaned forward in his chair. I continued before anyone could interrupt. "It was filed while I was employed at Roy Systems Group, but it was not filed under the company's name." I paused, long enough for the silence to stretch. It was filed under mine. The sound Calvin made wasn't a word. It was sharper than that, a breath pulled in too fast. His attorney turned toward him, eyes narrowing, as if asking a question he didn't want answered. The judge looked up. "Mr. Merton, are you claiming sole ownership of this patent?" "Yes, Your Honor, legally and factually." Calvin's attorney was on his feet immediately. "Your Honor, the company has full rights to all work produced during employment. The inventor was required to assign. Do you have documentation showing that assignment?" the judge asked. The attorney opened his mouth. "Closed it. We can provide." When the judge pressed, he hesitated, and hesitation is loud in a courtroom. I opened the red folder. The assignment was never completed. I said, "I have written confirmation from the United States Patent Office verifying that no transfer of ownership was ever filed." The clerk carried the document forward. The judge read it carefully. Then she read it again. Calvin didn't move. He just stared at the table, jaw tight, as if looking up might crack something open. "And the non-compete?" the judge asked. I nodded. "Roy Systems Group's non-compete applies only to company-owned intellectual property. This patent was never company-owned." A ripple moved through the room. Quiet, controlled, but unmistakable. Calvin's attorney tried to recover. Mr. Merton was a mid-level engineer at the time. "It's unlikely I opened the yellow folder. Here are the commit logs," I said. "Every line of code, every version, every timestamp, all tied directly to my employee credentials." The judge flipped through the pages slowly, methodically. Then she looked directly at Calvin. "You filed a lawsuit claiming he stole technology he legally owns." Calvin's mouth opened. Nothing came out. For the first time since I'd known him, Calvin Royce didn't look powerful. He looked exposed. The judge leaned back slightly. "This court will take a brief recess." The gavel struck. And as everyone stood, Calvin finally looked at me, not with confidence, not with arrogance, but with fear. Because the record had spoken, and it wasn't finished. The hallway outside the courtroom smelled faintly of old coffee and industrial cleaner. I leaned against the wall, laptop pressed to my chest, and waited. 15 minutes. That's all the judge had granted. Not enough time to rewrite a story, just enough time for panic to surface. Calvin Royce emerged first. Gone was the relaxed posture. Gone was the man who laughed when I walked in. His tie was loosened, his jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscle twitch. His attorney followed close behind, whispering urgently, hands slicing the air in sharp, restrained motions. Calvin didn't answer. He didn't even look at him. He just stared straight ahead, as if the floor might open and swallow him whole. I stayed where I was, didn't approach, didn't gloat. People assume victory looks loud. It doesn't. It looks like watching someone realize the ground under them isn't solid anymore, while they whispered. I opened my laptop. not to prepare a speech, to confirm something I'd noticed 2 nights earlier. During one of those sleepless nights, sorting through old work backups I'd saved legally during my employment, I'd found a folder I didn't recognize. It wasn't mine. The naming convention was different, sharper, executive. Inside were internal documents Calvin never meant for anyone else to see. Investor decks, contingency plans, notes labeled patent assurance talking points. I scrolled slowly, and then I understood. Royce Systems Group wasn't expanding, it was collapsing. Multiple failed funding rounds, 2 major clients preparing to exit quietly, an internal audit flagged for restricted circulation, and buried near the bottom one sentence that made my stomach tighten. Full patent control must be secured before Q3 to prevent investor withdrawal. That was it. That was the reason. The firing, the lawsuit, the urgency. Calvin hadn't sued me to protect the company. He'd sued me to save himself. The bailiff called us back in. When we returned to the courtroom, Calvin looked different, not defeated, cornered. A dangerous state for a man used to control. His attorney stood quickly. Your Honor, we request additional time to submit further documentation regarding the patent denied, the judge said without hesitation. You filed a claim without verification. Proceed, or this court will consider dismissal. That was when Calvin finally looked at me again. Not with anger, with calculation. As if asking himself how much I knew. His attorney attempted to reframe the narrative: administrative oversight, good faith assumptions, internal intent, but the words felt thin now. Hollow. When he finished, the judge turned to me. Mr. Merton, she said, do you have anything further to present at this time? I stood. Yes, Your Honor. I walked to the projector and connected my laptop. The screen flickered, then steadied. This document, I said, displaying the first slide, was stored on my work drive during my final week. I did not create it, but it references my patent as critical to maintaining investor confidence. Calvin's attorney shot up, objection, confidential corporate material. Your client sued him, the judge replied calmly. If it's relevant, it's admissible. I clicked to the next slide and watched Calvin's face go pale because the truth wasn't just coming out. It was lining up, and it was about to crush him. This paragraph explains everything you are about to hear. The room didn't move, not a cough, not a chair scraping the floor. Even the fluorescent light seemed to hum more quietly as the slide settled on the screen. Projected across the wall was an internal investor briefing, dates, numbers, forecasts, and right in the center, my work, my patent, labeled as secured proprietary control. I didn't rush to explain. I let the judge read. Her eyes tracked the page carefully, then lifted to Calvin, then back to the screen. This presentation states the company owns the algorithm outright, she said. Yes, Your Honor, I replied. That representation was made to investors. Calvin's attorney stood again, voice sharper now. Intent does not equal ownership. This is an internal misrepresentation, the judge finished calmly. If ownership was not secured, she turned to me. Continue. I clicked forward. This next document, I said, is an internal audit marked restricted. It outlines significant financial mismanagement and identifies the patent as the only asset capable of stabilizing investor confidence. The attorney sputtered. Your Honor, this is speculative. It's motive, the judge said, and motive is relevant. Calvin finally spoke. This is being taken out of context. His voice cracked on the last word. I looked at him for the first time since standing. Really looked. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even defensive anymore. He was scared. Context matters, I said. So does timing. I was fired weeks before these materials were circulated. The lawsuit followed immediately after. The urgency wasn't about protecting company secrets. It was about securing leverage. The judge leaned forward slightly. Mr. Royce, did you inform investors that patent ownership was disputed? Calvin's mouth opened. Closed. His attorney stepped in. Your Honor, the company believed belief, the judge said sharply, is not a legal strategy. She turned back to the documents. This audit indicates unauthorized fund reallocations, substantial ones. The color drained from Calvin's face. That suggests pressure. She continued, and an incentive to regain control of an asset you did not own. The room shifted, not loud, not dramatic, but decisive. Calvin's attorney lowered his gaze to the table. He knew it. I could see it in the set of his shoulders. The case they'd walked in expecting to dominate was collapsing under its own weight. The judge looked at me again. "Mr. Merton, are you alleging this lawsuit was filed as a means of financial self-preservation?" "Yes, Your Honor." Calvin shook his head faintly. "That's not enough," the judge said. "I've heard sufficient argument." She paused, fingers folded. "Before I rule," she said, "I need to ask one question." She looked directly at me. "Do you intend to file a counterclaim?" The room leaned in. I took a breath and chose my words carefully. "Not today, Your Honor," I said. "I'm here to clear my name. But if this continues, if another baseless claim is filed, I will pursue damages." Calvin looked up, hope flickered, then vanished, because the judge nodded slowly. "Understood." She lifted the gavel slightly, and in that moment, Calvin Royce realized this wasn't about winning anymore. It was about surviving what came next. The judge didn't speak right away. She sat there, hands folded, eyes moving from the documents to Calvin Royce, then back again. It wasn't hesitation, it was calculation, the kind that weighs consequences, not emotions. Calvin shifted in his chair. It was a small movement, but I noticed it. He'd spent years controlling rooms with posture alone. Now he couldn't find a position that felt safe. "Mr. Royce," the judge said finally, "this court takes allegations of intellectual property theft seriously. But what I see here is something else." She lifted one of the exhibits. "You filed claims asserting ownership without completing legal assignment. You presented that ownership as fact to investors, and you initiated litigation against the individual named as sole inventor." Her eyes narrowed. "That is not an oversight. That is reckless." Calvin's attorney tried once more. "Your Honor, we request a brief opportunity to number," she said firmly. "This court will not pause to allow retroactive justification." Silence followed. Heavy. Absolute. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt still, as if something inside me had finally stopped bracing for impact. The judge straightened. "This case lacks legal merit." Calvin's breath caught, audibly. "Furthermore," she continued, "the evidence suggests this action may have been filed in bad faith." The words landed harder than any accusation. She lifted the gavel. "This case is dismissed with prejudice. Court costs are awarded to the defendant." The sound of wood striking wood echoed through the room, sharp, final. Just like that, it was over. No speeches, no outbursts, no dramatic collapse, just a decision. Calvin didn't move. His attorney leaned toward him, whispering urgently, but Calvin stared straight ahead, eyes unfocused, as if the ruling hadn't reached him yet. The man who had laughed when I walked into this room now looked hollowed out. I gathered my folders calmly. Blue, red, yellow, slid the laptop back into my bag. As I stood, Calvin finally looked up. Our eyes met. There was no anger there, no arrogance, just disbelief. "Mr. Merton," the judge said before I turned away, "you are free to go." I nodded. "Thank you, Your Honor." I walked toward the exit. Each step felt lighter than the last, not because I'd won, but because I wasn't carrying his lie anymore, behind me. I heard Calvin speak my name, quietly, broken. I didn't turn around. Some conversations end when the truth is spoken aloud, outside. The afternoon light felt too bright, too ordinary for something that had just changed everything. I stood on the courthouse steps for a moment, breathing in air that didn't feel borrowed anymore. Freedom didn't arrive with applause. It arrived with silence. And that was enough. If you leave here, you will miss the most important thing. I didn't go far. I sat on the stone steps outside the courthouse, the folder strap still pressing into my palm, and let the noise of the city pass through me. Cars moved, people laughed. Someone argued into a phone a few feet away. The world hadn't paused for my verdict. That felt right. For months, my life had revolved around a single lie. Now that lie had been stripped bare, and everything else could finally move again. I didn't check my phone right away. When I finally did, the messages had already started. A recruiter I'd spoken to months earlier, a former colleague who had gone silent after my firing, an unfamiliar number with a short message. Heard about the ruling. Call me. The lawsuit's dismissal traveled fast, faster than I expected. Court records update quietly, but reputations don't. By evening, the story had reached the people Calvin feared most, the board. By the end of the week, 3 investors had frozen pending commitments. 1 withdrew entirely. The internal audit I'd referenced, meant to stay buried, found its way into the hands of someone who didn't owe Calvin loyalty. Calvin Royce didn't step down immediately. Men like him rarely do. But the shift was visible. Subtle at first. Missed meetings, canceled appearances. A carefully worded press release about strategic reassessment. Then, silence. 2 weeks later. The board announced an internal review. 4 weeks later. Calvin was placed on administrative leave. I learned about it the same way I'd learned about most things lately, through someone else's whisper. No celebration, no satisfaction, just confirmation. What surprised me most wasn't his fall. It was how little I needed to watch it. I didn't give interviews, didn't post statements, didn't correct the rumors that floated online. Silence had done enough work already, instead. I focused on rebuilding the parts of my life I'd let shrink while I was fighting to survive. Sleep came easier. Food tasted like something again. I stopped flinching when my phone buzzed. And then, one afternoon, an email arrived. From Calvin. 2 sentences. No subject line. Gregory. I never meant for it to go that far. I was trying to keep the company alive. I stared at it for a long time. Then I closed the message. Some explanations come too late to change anything. Some apologies aren't meant to be answered. What mattered was this: I was no longer reacting to someone else's panic. I was choosing what came next. The patent was still mine. The work still spoke for itself. And for the first time since I'd walked into that courtroom under someone else's shadow, my future felt quiet, clear, mine. I didn't rush back into anything. For the first time in years, no one was pulling me by the calendar, no deadlines disguised as emergencies, no meetings scheduled to prove relevance. The quiet felt unfamiliar at first, then necessary. I rented a small desk in a shared workspace on the edge of the city. Nothing impressive, a clean table, a window that caught the late afternoon light, a light that no one there knew my name or my story. They didn't need to. What mattered was the work. Companies began reaching out slowly, carefully, not with sympathy, but with curiosity. They had questions about systems that didn't break under pressure, about architectures designed by someone who had already seen what happened when control was built on shortcuts. I chose my clients the same way I chose my mornings, deliberately. No long-term contracts, no rushed timelines, clear terms, clear exits. The patent stayed in my name. Every agreement acknowledged it in writing. The first time I signed my own consulting invoice, my hand shook, not from fear, from recognition. This was mine. I worked fewer hours than I ever had at Royce Systems Group, but the work felt heavier in the right way. Focused, honest, no wasted motion, no need to prove anything beyond what the system did when tested. Occasionally, someone would mention Calvin, not directly, never by name, just references to recent leadership changes or unexpected restructuring. I listened without comment. His story no longer required my attention. What had surprised me was how often people asked the same question. Why didn't you countersue? They expected anger, a public reckoning, numbers, headlines. I told them the truth. Because I didn't need revenge to move forward. I needed distance, clarity, control over my own time. The court had done its job. I was doing mine. One evening, after everyone else had left the workspace, I stayed late, watching the city lights come on one by one. My laptop hummed quietly, steady as it always had been. 3 years ago. I'd bought it out of necessity. Now it felt like a witness. I thought about the courtroom, about the laughter that started everything, about how fragile certainty becomes when the record speaks. Power doesn't always collapse loudly. Sometimes it dissolves, and what's left is space. Space to rebuild. Space to decide what kind of work deserves your energy. Space to breathe without permission. I shut the laptop and packed my bag. As I stepped outside, my phone buzzed with a message from a new client confirming terms I'd set without negotiation. I smiled, not because I'd won, but because I was no longer surviving someone else's decisions. I was shaping my own, and that was the kind of ending that didn't need applause. The first time someone recognized me, it wasn't in a courtroom or a boardroom. It was at a small industry meetup in a converted warehouse, the kind with folding chairs and coffee that tasted burned no matter how early you arrived. I'd been invited to speak about system resilience, nothing dramatic, no backstory required. Afterward, as people filtered out, a man in his early 30s approached me, nervous, hesitant. He introduced himself, then paused, as if deciding whether to say what he'd come for. I almost quit my job last year, he said. My manager kept taking credit for my work. I thought that was just how things were. I didn't interrupt. But someone mentioned your case, he continued. Not the details, just how you handled it. It made me document everything, set boundaries. I didn't quit. I negotiated. It changed everything. He thanked me and left before I could respond properly. I stood there longer than I needed to. That moment stayed with me. Not because it felt like victory, but because it reframed what had happened. The courtroom hadn't been the end of the story. It had been the beginning of something quieter. A ripple. I started noticing it elsewhere. Emails from people I didn't know, asking careful questions about ownership, about how to protect work without burning bridges. Short conversations that began with, "This might sound familiar," and ended with relief. I never gave legal advice, never positioned myself as a cautionary tale. I just told the truth. Document your work, know what you sign, protect your name. Those weren't dramatic lessons. They were practical ones, the kind that don't trend but last, occasionally. I thought about Calvin again, not with anger, with distance. I learned he'd resigned quietly. No press tour, no apology. Just a line item in a quarterly report and a new name on the letterhead. The company survived, smaller and humbler. As most things do after illusions collapse, I didn't feel responsible for that. Truth doesn't destroy companies, lies do. One night, walking home, I passed the courthouse without realizing it at first. The building looked smaller than I remembered, less imposing, just stone and glass doing what buildings do. I stopped for a moment. That heavy door, the laughter, the silence that followed. It all felt far away now. What remained was something steadier. A sense that my work didn't need permission to matter, that standing up once had changed how I stood everywhere else. I kept walking, because the story wasn't about what I took from that room. It was about what I carried forward. I didn't mark the anniversary of the trial. No reminder on my calendar, no quiet ritual. The date passed the way healed things often do without asking to be remembered. What stayed with me wasn't the ruling, or the moment Calvin's certainty collapsed. It wasn't even the sound of the gavel. It was the feeling I carried out of that building. Lightness, not the kind that comes from winning, the kind that comes from no longer being misnamed. For a long time, I'd let other people define what my work meant, how valuable it was, who owned it. Standing in that courtroom forced me to see something I should have known earlier. Your work is more than output. It's identity, and identity deserves protection. Life didn't transform overnight. Some weeks were slow. Some clients backed out, others tested boundaries the way people do when they sense you've learned to say no. But each time, it got easier. Clear terms, clear exits, no panic. The patent stayed in my name, not as a trophy but as a reminder. I didn't build my future on revenge. I built it on precision, on choosing who deserved my attention, on working with people who didn't need control to feel powerful, on leaving rooms when the cost of staying became too high. Occasionally, someone would ask if I'd do it all again. Fight, document, stand alone in a room stacked against me. The honest answer, I hope I never have to. But I know I could. That knowledge changed everything. One evening, as I shut down my laptop and turned off the lights in my workspace, I caught my reflection in the glass. Older, quieter, steadier. Not hardened, just clear. The man looking back wasn't someone trying to survive someone else's ambition. He was someone building his own. And if there's one thing I'd leave behind for anyone listening, anyone standing at the edge of a decision they didn't choose, it's this. Your story doesn't end when someone powerful laughs at you. Sometimes. That's exactly where it begins. As this story concludes, what I retain isn't the victory, but the clarity of my own worth. If you've listened this far, thank you for staying with me. What detail struck you most? Where did you hear this story from? Share your thoughts in the comments. Hit like if it resonated with you, and share this video with someone who needs more courage. Subscribe to the channel because there are so many more stories waiting to be told.